Unfortunately, today there's no insult. I know you're all very disappointed. This is not, this is I'm walking on the wild side and I'm dealing with uninsulting poetry today. I'm going to be dealing instead with a little studied, little known poet. Her name is Compiuta Donzella, and a lot of the talk today is going to be raising questions, and then we'll get to her poetry towards the end. Before I continue on, though, I want to thank you all for coming, and I hope you all enjoyed your gelato. Sometimes we in Italian sometimes get the question of, what purpose, what can you do if you study Italian? And my answer is just right out there, and that's you can have gelato. So that's, you can do other things with other languages, but we have the food. So, and French too, in fairness. So I want to take you back about 700 years. I want to take you back to the middle of the 1200s. At least 3 centuries before Gutenberg invented the printing press. So when writing was done by hand, this is, literally what the word manuscript means. Writing in the vernacular was still unusual. That is, if you were writing in Latin. The vernacular, in fact, hadn't been established as a national language in Europe, or national languages, I should say, in Europe. The political organization for much of Europe was an organization that no longer exists, the Holy Roman Empire. What was that? First of all, I always tell my students, don't confuse that with the Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is something entirely different. If you imagine the map of Europe and go east of France and you go west of Russia and you take that central swath that goes north to south, that includes Italy in the south, that is the Holy Roman Empire. It didn't function very well. In fact, the old joke is it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And it's a cliche, but it also really helps understand it functioned actually fairly poorly. In Italy, and Italy is blocked off from the rest of Central Europe by the Alps, it was nominally under the empire. In fact, Italy had been conferred, the various city-states of Italy had been conferred semi-autonomy or autonomy over a century earlier. And so they were actually having exercises in self-governance, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. And I want to take you to a time when poetry was primarily recited or sung. The idea of private silent reading, yeah, there were people who did that, but you also had people who would sing it or recite it. And in fact, singing is a key word here. We may actually be talking about musical accompaniment. Sadly, we don't have the musical notation for the poetry of this period. Before I move on, though, I want to get into the title of my talk, and you're going to notice that very important question mark. This is the question I'm going to be asking for the first maybe 20 minutes of my talk, which is, what do we know about her? This is actually a very problematic title. There may be other women poets. And in fact, we're not even sure about her, and that's where I'm going with this. But there are two other candidates for the first Italian woman poet. And I want to start off by saying a little bit about the two of them. There's one poet we know about, or we think we know about. Her name was Gaya De Camino. And we know about her because her father is mentioned by Dante in Purgatory. And some of the commentaries on the Divine Comedy from the 1300s mention, when he talks about her father, mention her and mention that she was in fact famous as a poet. There's one problem with Gaya De Camino. We don't have any poetry. So, okay, she's not a great candidate for calling the first woman poet. We know something about her, but we don't have it. There's a second possible contender for the first woman poet in Italian literature. And her name was Nina. She was from Sicily, so we called her Nina Siciliana, which means Nina the Sicilian. We have one sonnet by this person. There is a problem, though, and that is that the language is so stereotyped. It's a very stereotyped topic, so we don't really see the person behind it. It could have been written by anybody. And so we don't really know what to do with that sonnet. She's pretty good. She's a pretty good contender for the first poet. But really the first poet we want to deal with is somebody else. Her name is Compiuta Donzella, and this is where we're going. So you can see Compiuta Donzella, and here we have a second problem. What the heck kind of name is this? In fact, as you can tell by the title of my slide, it's not even clear if this is a name or if this is a pseudonym. Let me explain. There were records of other women named Compiuta. Actually, if we were to translate, let me step back. If we were to translate her name literally, it means the accomplished or fulfilled damsel. So right there we have a problem. It literally means something else. Now, Compiuta, there are records of women named Compiuta. So it could be like, instead of saying the fulfilled or accomplished damsel, could be the damsel Compiuta. So that could be her name. But literally, as you can tell here, it literally means fulfilled or accomplished damsel. This really starts sounding like a pseudonym. And to make matters worse, if we just flip the adjective and the noun, which is allowable in Italian, that's actually, donzella compiuta is actually an expression indicating a woman of marriageable age, probably in her late teens. So that it could be something like a pseudonym like, young lady or something along those lines. So what do we make of this? Is she a real woman? Well, there's reason to suspect that she was. When we read her poetry, and here's a good contrast with with Nina Siciliana, you really get a sense of the person. She wrote three sonnets, but there's more to it than that. There's really a sense of a human being. And so she's really our best contender for the first women poet of Italian literature. Before I move off of this, I've been talking about this pseudonym. One other problem, and it has been debated a little bit, was there was also the fashion of men writing in the voice of women, and this is why the Nina is really problematic, because when they did so, they would write as, for instance, an abandoned woman or a woman in love or something. This is where it gets very stereotyped, and we know about them because very frequently you'd have the man's name attached to it, but it's in the woman's voice. And so this has also raised the question of, is this a pseudonym? Is this really a woman? So here's what we know about her. There's one manuscript that contains her poetry. It's Vatican Latin 3793, okay, which means that we know it's in the Vatican Library. It uses the Latin script. If you've never been in the Vatican Library, first of all, it's nothing like Dan Brown, okay? They don't put you in glass containers and suck out the oxygen. They're actually very nice people. But it's such a large library that what they do is they either have their main archive, or they have other families' archives that have been donated over the years, but then they subdivide it according to what kind of script it is. Okay, so you'll often see the Vatican, right, which is that V, or you'll see the name of the donation, the family name, but then right after it tells you what script, not what language, what script. Okay, so this is the Latin script, which of course we use in English, we use in Italian, we use in Latin, and on and on and on, as opposed to Greek or Hebrew or a whole bunch of other languages that are represented. What is this manuscript? Well, it was compiled around in the 1260s or thereabouts. It is one of the most important compendiums of Italian literature in the 1200s. It's one of three. This gives us most of what we know about this period. There are over 800 poems in this particular manuscript. Of those, over 600 are sonnets, and we'll talk about sonnets in a little bit. So it's just enormous. It was compiled in Florence. And it also was compiled in a particular script. Now you're probably thinking Gothic, okay, which was one form of script. There are actually many forms of Gothic, which is if you take a goose quill and you cut it in certain ways. And by the way, you would strip off all of the feather except for the very tail end. It's just the quill. I know they do that in the movies because it looks cool, but you're going to be cutting it back constantly because it's going to be getting dull. So you're not going to want all that feather there. This handwriting is in a particular subgroup of the Gothic script. It's called mercantesca, which means it's the mercantile script. Now that tells us something. It was probably a merchant who compiled or had this manuscript compiled. It's not in any of the author's hands. So there were scribes who compiled the thing. But since it was preserved, it's one of the most important compendia of the time. It's just as Italian literature is getting started. And by the way, you can see the image I took from the manuscript, La Compiuta Donzella di Firenze. It tells us she's from Florence. So this is what we know. In addition, there was an anonymous sonnet or anonymous poet who wrote to her, and another poet, Mastro Torrigiano, who also wrote to her. Then each wrote 2 sonnets. Both of them are addressing her and talking to her as a woman. This is really important because going back to that question of, well, could it have been a man writing in the voice of? Well, they're not treating her as a man. They're treating her as a woman. And I'm going to get more into that a little bit later, but for now, just keep that in mind, that they're talking to her as a woman. There's another poet, and he's really the major poet in the pre-Dante age. His name was Guittone d'Arezzo. He is the most disliked poet of all of Italian literature, including me. Okay, I just throw myself in there because what he really did was he really explored the style, and he does a lot of wordplay, and it's just this impenetrable fog. It's just amazing. But he was a real big deal at the time. There was a whole school of imitators, and he was just the big deal. Okay, he was the Elvis of the pre-Dante period. Now, he also wrote some epistles, and he wrote an epistle to a woman whom he repeatedly describes as accomplished. He keeps punning on the word accomplished or accomplishment, compiuta, compiuto, or the verb compiere, or so forth, and it's all over the place. And so it's real easy to look at this, and it kind of ties in with one of her sonnets that we're going to get to. It looks like it was written to her. And again, it talks to her as a woman. So that going into this question of, well, could it have been a man writing in the voice of? Probably not. We're getting too much corroboration that it was a woman. She's attracting attention as a woman poet. And before I move on, there was actually a debate about 100 years ago as to whether it was a man, again. And part of the argumentation at the time was that, well, a woman poet would have attracted a lot of attention, to which the answer is, she did. But, you know, I don't want to go there. So what don't we know? Well, we don't know her name, or we kind of know her name. We don't know her family. So we don't know anything about her status, her class, her occupation, if she had one. And most importantly, we don't know who she was. We don't know her identity, her biography. And as we're going to see, and this comes up all the time when I teach her to my undergraduates, I always have students at the end of class in my gen ed classes going, so what happened afterwards? To which the answer is, I don't know. We don't know if she was of the family of the nobles or of the merchants. Now bear in mind, and I'm going to get into this in a moment, this is a false dichotomy because we're dealing with the city. And so the distinction between noble and merchant is just a convenience. They were intermarrying like crazy, and even at the time, people couldn't tell them apart. I like to say it's kind of like the Sneetches. At the end, you couldn't tell who was a Starbelly Sneetch and who wasn't. So there's an Elvis reference and a Dr. Seuss reference at the same talk. And same thing, you know. It's easy for us in a discussion here. I mentioned this already. I won't get into it in great detail. Her gender's been debated. I mentioned that there's a tradition of writing in the voice of a woman, and that, you know, the other people are talking to her as a woman. Now, what do they say to her? This sounds condescending to our ears. Let me restate that. This is condescending. Both of them talk to her, and they marvel that there can be such wisdom and knowledge in a woman. Okay, that doesn't pass muster these days, but at the time, what they're really saying is, look at what you've accomplished. This is interesting. And again, putting it in the context of the time, they're basically not saying, oh, come on, I know it's you, Dave. I mean, they're not saying you're a man. They're saying you're a woman. Look how interesting this is. And look at what you've accomplished. So it sounds condescending to our ears. It is condescending. But in the context of the time, they're being actually very complimentary. They don't suggest she's a man. Oops, I went too quickly. Nowadays, when there is scholarship on her, everybody accepts that she's a woman. That's an old debate. She tends to write about the experiences of women. She doesn't want to marry the person her father has picked out for her. That's what we're going to see in the two poems that we're discussing today. Now, the question then comes up, is that her own experience? This is why I distinguish between, is this a biographical experience? That is this hers? And unfortunately, we don't have the information to say yes or no. Or is she fictionalizing the experiences of other women around her? But that seems to be what she's doing in her poetry. When men, and I mentioned this before, when men wrote in the voice of women, they wrote in very stock situations. So, since we know, or can pretty safely assume that she was a woman, let's talk about women in medieval Florence. In what is probably the greatest understatement that will be said today on this campus, the Middle Ages weren't good for women. I often joke with my students that if you get caught in a time vortex and you're female, don't go to the Middle Ages. For that matter, if you're a man, don't go to the Middle Ages either. But anyway. Why? Well, there are a lot of restrictions on women in the Middle Ages. It was not a good period for women overall. Okay? For instance, the teachings about women and the teachings about gender were very, again, to our ears, derisive, for lack of a better word. It was said that, because God made Adam in his image, men were more spiritual. Eve was made in Adam's image, so women are more fleshly. And so the idea was that women were more prone to fleshly failings, the sins of the flesh, and on and on and on. And you see this over and over again. Women are a lesser creature than man. Okay? When Aristotle was being reintroduced, Aristotle had a different idea of how the sexes arise. That has to do with the four characteristics of bodies, and it said that men were hot and dry and women were colder and wetter. Okay? And these are two of the four characteristics. What do I mean by that? Well, literally, women were imperfect men. The idea being that as a fetus is gestating in the uterus, if it's hotter, it'll turn out to be male, and if it's colder, it tends to be female. Now, you noticed where my hands were going, even though I don't have the appropriate organs. There's a reason for that. It was understood that the liver was the heat-generating organ. This is why we're warm-blooded creatures, is because we have a liver. So the idea that if the fetus implanted closer to the liver on the right, it would be male, and further to the left, it would be female. And they actually had an idea for intersex if it implanted dead center. Okay? And so you have people saying, well, if a woman wants to give birth to a boy, she should lay on her right side after intercourse, and on and on and on. The idea being that the fetus, a female fetus or a female baby, is for lack of a better word, an undercooked male. What's that?
Maybe a man might be
a dried out egg. Well, we can argue with them, but that's what they said. Yeah. There were also, and in fact, anyway, but I mean, you can see where this is all going. This is all teachings at the time, whether we're talking physiology, theology, and so forth. There were a lot of stereotypes, really ugly stereotypes about women. Okay, and again, if we go into theology, we can go to Christian doctrine. Paul wrote in the New Testament that women should be silent and men should have power over them. This, of course, dominated church thought, but it spread out through all of society. A lot of the church fathers wrote misogynistic treatises with the idea that, we want men to be celibate in monasteries, and so therefore let's make it so that women are the most horrible creatures you could possibly imagine. And they write, you see Augustine and Jerome and on and on and on. Women were overly talkative, and so they disturbed the peace. Why would you want to be married to a woman? These are all the stereotypes, and I could go on all night about just the stereotypes of women in the Middle Ages. There are other aspects of the Middle Ages. I don't want to get into too many details about the theological prohibitions and the stereotypes. Women were excluded from most political power. That kind of goes without saying. Now, Florence was a republic. Okay, I mentioned that earlier about the Holy Roman Empire. It was a type of republic. This actually made matters worse because you couldn't be In a republic, you have elected representatives. So you couldn't be born a queen or a princess or something. Okay? So it even made it more exclusive. And if we go to economics, a lot of the ancient laws were that property passed from the father to the husband to the son and bypassed possession by women altogether. Now, everything I've just said is true, but we need to put some nuance on it. So let's go to some of the on the other hand. First and most important thing, we're talking about a city. Now, many people have been to Florence and they marvel at the beauty of the Renaissance architecture and the beauty of the Renaissance and late medieval art. And then they frequently fail to ask the most important question, which is, how the heck did they pay for all of this? It has to do with the fact that it's a city. And in this period, and I'm talking now in much broader strokes than before, that is, for several centuries, Florence was at the forefront of what would be the earliest capitalist economy. So it's growing and it's becoming far wealthier than other areas in Europe. How is this happening? Trade. Also, manufacturing. And later, banking. Trade, because Florence was at the forefront. Now, it isn't just Florence in the 1200s. Florence is at the forefront of this economic boom that is taking place predominantly in Italy. They're manufacturing goods, they're selling goods, they're trading in goods. How much economic power did they amass in this time? What Florence was trading in were woolen goods. They were manufacturing woolen goods. Now, many people have been to Italy. There's great sheep all over Italy, and you're probably thinking, oh, okay, they're shearing the sheep from Tuscany or what have you. No, they were importing wool from Scotland, making that into woolen goods and selling it at a marked up price, bringing in money to the city. Once you start amassing money, you can then start developing banking. So that instead of amassing money at a big rate, you're amassing money at a huge rate. In fact, a lot of our words for banking to this day come from anglicized versions of Italian words. The word bank, for instance, comes from banco, which just meant a counter, which is where you would exchange your coins. Okay? Interest, you have an interest, a stake in the enterprise. Now, this is all extremely important because this means that they're capitalizing their economy so that people can start up new enterprises with the banking that's taking place. In the city of Florence, in the 1200s alone, it grew fivefold. It started off, the census at the start of the 1200s was at about 20,000 citizens. By 1305, it was over 105 citizens. They had to rebuild the city walls several times just in the 1 century. That's because people are coming into the city as it's expanding physically, and it's expanding in terms of this economic growth, this economic boom. It's a boom town. So when you go back to Florence, next time you're in Florence, enjoy the gelato, and then that's how they paid all those pesky artists and architects for this beautiful city. Okay? What that means, though, is that it's not just growing economically, but there are changes going on. We have a historian, Giovanni Villani, who talks about the education of boys and girls, 10,000 of them, he says, in the public schools. They were being taught to read and arithmetic. Now, here's another important point. I'm going to just add a parenthetical comment. Arithmetic in Italy, they had just introduced, I should say, Arabic numerals. That gave the Italian merchants an advantage, because to do mathematics with Roman numerals, you have to memorize large tables of formulas, which is not how most of us grew up learning mathematics. We learn how to do it, right? It's a method we learn now, and that's the advantage. And that's one of the one of the advantages the Italians had economically. So why are these girls being taught reading? Now, what they're being taught is not Latin. They're being taught the vernacular. They're being taught mathematics. This is so that they could participate in the economic enterprises. So they could participate in the family's businesses. Right. They have to be able to participate if, for instance, there's a reason why they're participating in their father's, their husband's, their son's enterprises, their brother's enterprises. So this is allowing a certain level of education. Now, it doesn't go to the higher education. Higher education is still restricted to men. But you do have this middle level of education that's taking place in Florence. Let me mention a couple other things. Because it's a mercantile city, they have laws in effect. You have to have property rights. Now, one of the property rights, the laws that they used were the ancient laws from ancient Rome, the Code of Justinian, which I will say never really went away. Because there was always an urban tradition in Italy. Most of the time we think Middle Ages, you think of people running around wearing furs in the woods and with horned helmets. That never happened in Italy. That's the other part of Europe. In Italy, there were still cities. They weren't doing very well. Rome got down to about 10,000 inhabitants. So they weren't doing great. But the city, there's a continuity from ancient Rome through the Middle Ages. And the law, and there's a continuity with it, which is the Code of Justinian, which is from the 6th century. Justinian was the emperor, and he codified all of Roman law. And this was in effect. Now, the Code of Justinian actually afforded certain rights to women. Property rights. So I mentioned that it goes from father to husband, right, through the dowry. But we also have a lot of legal cases where women sued if their husbands were idiots. In fact, if you're interested in this, you can get a nice NEH grant and go to the archives in Florence, and there's a whole bunch of this. Because if the husband was incompetent, if he was drunk or stupid or just an idiot, however you choose to define it, the courts were actually very generous in giving the property rights to the wife. It was a way of protecting the dowry, her family's property. And what we know through a census of the economic through the economic records, and you can again go to the Archive of Florence if you want to study this, up to 10% of all businesses in Florence were female controlled. Either daughters, mothers, widows controlling the enterprise, or they were able to wrest control from the husband. And so in this case, and I mentioned this to point out, we have to have some nuance. Yes, the Middle Ages were bad for women, but it wasn't all 100% bad all the time. There were these ways that you could work with the system, that the patriarchal view offered some protections because it protected the family and protected the family's property. Now, there's one other thing I want to mention about before we move back to La Compiuta Donzella. It's very easy for us to forget about the living culture, the oral culture, the folkloric culture, the vernacular, the spoken culture, which is actually probably the bulk of the culture. What I've done is I've cited a passage from Dante. This is from Paradiso. And here you can see Dante is actually saying this is one of the major areas that women are contributing. He's talking about Florentine women, and he says, this one, that is a Florentine woman, watched late in her care of the cradle and comforting, used the idiom that first delights mothers and fathers. So he's talking about the vernacular language. This is how Dante understood the vernacular language, which we understand as Florentine, now Italian. It's transmitted in the family. And he's ascribing it to women. The other, that is another Florentine woman, drawing the strands from her distaff, told with her household tales of the Trojans, of Fiesole, and of Rome. So we're getting legends, family narratives. And here you can see that the topics of the Aeneid, I see my colleague Cynthia White in the audience, who teaches the Aeneid. You can see the topics of the Aeneid actually entered the oral culture at the time. So they're saying what Dante is talking about is this living oral culture. Sometimes we, especially in the humanities, tend to overly focus at times on written texts, on documents. And it's easy to forget there's a whole living culture that accompanies them, especially for things like the Middle Ages. I like to use the analogy that we're kind of like paleontologists, that the texts are kind of like the fossils, but there's a whole ecosystem that produced them. And we have to keep that very much in mind. It's easy for us to look at the documents and say, well, there was only one woman poet of the 1200s. Well, that doesn't mean there were no women and they weren't contributing to the culture. There's just only one that left documents that were transmitted to us. So this is a very important point that I wanted to make before we go back to La Compiuta Donzella. So let's go back to her. We know one more thing. I mentioned earlier what we don't know and what little we do know, but we do know one other thing. We can look at her poetry, and she's extremely knowledgeable of the literary traditions of Italy and of Europe at the time. I mentioned she wrote 2 sonnets. The sonnet was a new form, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Her language that she uses a lot of the language of courtly love. A lot of you are familiar with the language of courtly love, the idea that medieval lords and ladies were in a tower in some sort of feudal setting, and they're wooing one another. Of course, we can always imagine the damsels with the conical hat with the little fabric off the end and so forth. And so what you do is, oh, my dear lady, I'm going to go out and do some great deeds so that perhaps you'll hand your hanky over to me or what have you. She's using this language. She's very knowledgeable about it, and this was very prevalent in the Florence and in the Italy of her time. So that she is very knowledgeable of the literary tradition. There's another literary tradition we're going to see, and this is less commonly known nowadays. It's called Contemptus Mundi, and this comes out of the religious tradition. Contemptus Mundi means hatred for the world. And it's a satiric tradition. It talks about how the world is fallen and corrupted, society is corrupted, and of course it's all our fault because of our human sin. And so it'll often talk about how backwards thing, like the just is laid low, but the evil person is exalted, and on and on and on. And she is very knowledgeable about that tradition as well. We're going to see that in the second sonnet that we look at tonight. So that she really knows literature well. She also knows about the sonnet form. Now, I mentioned that the only real date we have for her is about the 1260s. The sonnet was invented in Sicily in the 1230s. It is a new form in her time. The sonnet is a highly structured form. Now, some of you may be thinking, okay, I've read Shakespeare's sonnet, you know, my lover's eyes are nothing like the sun. That's a different form of sonnet, okay? Both the Italian sonnet and the English sonnet have 14 lines, but the Italian sonnet has got even some more structures. Okay, so you're going to have 2 quatrains. You're going to have 2 stanzas with 4 verses. You're going to have a very specific rhyme scheme in that. Then you're going to have 2 stanzas of 3, and you're going to have specific rhyme schemes there. You're going to have a specific meter. In other words, the sonnet, if you write a sonnet, that doesn't just happen. This is not an oral form. This isn't a spontaneous form. You have to know how to do it. This is a very structured, very literary form. It'll make what I was just saying about the 4-4-3-3, it'll make more sense if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about when I get to them. We see some other techniques that, and I'll point out a couple when we get to them. So this again raises the question, how did she learn this? Now, this would not have been taught in the schools. The answer is, I don't know. But she's very knowledgeable. She's an extremely good poet. So let's actually look at her poetry, and maybe this will start making some more sense. This is the first of the 2 sonnets that's not written in response to the person, the anonymous writer. That third one is very uninteresting because it simply is it's basically a back and forth. Now, I've done the translation. Here you can see the 2 stanzas of 4, 2 stanzas of 3, but I'm not such a good translator that I could keep the rhyme scheme, so I apologize about that. In the season that grows flowers and leaves, gaiety grows for all fine lovers. They wander together to the gardens where the little birds make sweet songs. All frank people fall in love together, and they come forth to serve one another. And every damsel lives in joy. But for me, pain and tears are in abundance. For my father has treated me wrongly, and he makes me live in strong pain. He wants to force me to marry a lord for whom I have neither will nor desire. And I live each hour in great torment. Neither flower nor leaf rejoices me. Now here's a very important technique, and you can see that this didn't just happen. The flowers and leaves, flower nor leaf. She's tying in the first verse with the last verse. This is an advanced poetic technique that many good poets at the time used. So let's move on. I've been talking about courtly love. The words and expressions in purple are directly out of that tradition. So we have, the season that grows flowers and leaves in the springtime. That's the time you always fall in love. For those of us who work on campus, it's crazy. All of a sudden, all your students, they're not paying attention in class anymore. Or they are, but not to you. Anyway. Gaiety grows for all fine lovers. They're going to the gardens. We can imagine these beautiful medieval noble gardens. Little birds. Again, we're getting back to this springtime. Frank people. Frank would be a way of talking about nobility at the time, as well as they're serving one another. That's how you, in medieval poetry, courtly love poetry, that's how you woo somebody. You have to go do something. You're doing a service, as if you're doing a service for a lord. And every damsel lives in joy. If we only had the first 8 verses, it's very well done. It's very well wrought. But if we only had those first 8 verses, this poem wouldn't be as interesting because it's stereotyped. Now, she's doing that on purpose because that didn't just happen. But if we'd had a manuscript that somehow the page got torn, we didn't have the last 6 verses, we'd go, okay. Just like Nina Siciliana, it doesn't tell us very much. We don't see the human being. It's when we move to the next half of the sonnet that we suddenly sit up and take notice. Suddenly we see a human experience. We see a human being peeking around the stereotype language, and we suddenly go, this is interesting. Because it's here we seem to have a human experience. She's talking about her father, about how her father has picked somebody for her to marry. Marriages at the time were arranged. Now, they couldn't be done against your will. She has the ability to say no, but there could be a lot of pressures, including physical abuse, to convince the child to marry whoever it is they've picked for her. And they were arranged for the matters of expediency. If she's of the nobility, it might be to unify with, say, a rich merchant family or with another noble family. If she's of the merchants, same thing, with maybe a noble family or some other business reason, so that this part is suddenly very personal. Or, again, human. We don't know that this happened to her because we don't have anything about her. We just know that this is something we've never seen before. I don't know of any other medieval poem in Italian where suddenly there's talk about, I don't want to marry the guy my dad picked for me. That just doesn't happen. There's a lot of innovation in the poetry of the 1200s, but that doesn't happen. And I don't imagine that a man would have written this. Again, it's not impossible. Everything's possible, I guess. But it just doesn't strike me as very likely. Let's go to the second poem. And here we're going to see the Contemptus Mundi tradition. I wish to leave the world behind and serve God and distance myself from all vanity. For I see insanity and villainy and falsity growing and flourishing. And still wisdom and courtesy are dying, along with fine honors and goodness. For I wish to have neither husband nor lord, nor to stay in the world of my own will. Recalling that all men clothe themselves with evil, I am disdainful of all of them, and my person turns instead toward God. My father makes me be melancholy, for he wishes to turn me from serving Christ. I don't know whom he wants to marry me to. Now, here again, if the purple verses, it doesn't quite fall according to the structure of the sonnet like the first one. If we only had these purple verses, again, we wouldn't be that interested in it because there's contemptus mundi everywhere. It's a very stereotyped trope. We don't really see the human being. It is part of the language of the time. And you can see what I was talking about earlier about how the world is corrupt, insanity and villainy and falsity are growing and flourishing. That's not how it should be, but that's what the world has become because of human sin and human folly. Similarly, down here, all men clothe themselves with evil, and I wish to turn instead towards God. Contemptus mundi is about the rejection of the world and the desire to go to the convent or in the monastery. So again, just like with the other poem, she's mixing stereotyped language with her own personal experience or historical experience. It's the other parts that make us sit up and take notice. This idea, and it seems to reiterate, it doesn't seem to reiterate, it reiterates what was in the other poem about she doesn't want to marry this one, and you see it perfectly clearly. My father makes me be melancholy. He doesn't, I don't know whom he wants to marry me to. It suddenly becomes very personal. Now, I want to just come to a couple of other questions, and then I'm going to stop here. What do we make of this? Could this be part of a literary trope? There was a literary trope of what's called the malmaritata, the unhappily married woman. And this is a song of a woman whose husband is jealous or mistreats her, sometimes physically, but she really wants to be with her lover instead. By the way, medieval poetry, love and marriage do not go together like a horse and carriage. The idea that you'd be in love with your husband or wife was inconceivable. Does this fit? And there are some scholars who say, well, maybe this is a malmaritata. Does anybody see a problem with that? She's not married. I don't know. I know some other malmaritata written by men. Again, going back to the stereotyped language. She's not married. She's saying, I don't want to be married to this guy. There's another interpretation that sometimes maybe she's doing a trope from saints' lives. You guys are probably most familiar with St. Francis of Assisi, whose father chained him up rather than allow him to pursue his calling. And eventually, to reject his father, he strips himself naked in the piazza, and fortunately the cardinal is there to run out and cover him with a little robe. And so I recently read an article about her saying, well, is this maybe this trope about parental resistance to taking vows? And again, in the first sonnet, there ain't nothing about vows. And in the second, it doesn't really stress that she does say she wants to serve Christ and all that, but the emphasis is really on what she doesn't want. I really don't want to marry this guy. So this one, too, it doesn't hold water for me. I keep coming back to, I use these two examples to close, to really come back to, I really think we're talking about someone who is either versifying her own experience or versifying the experience of people around her. Because these are the only stereotyped languages that make sense, and it doesn't really fit. So I come back to, this is biographical. Is it something she experienced, or is it historical? Something she didn't experience, but maybe she had friends who were experiencing it, and she decided to put it in verse. And that's where I come back to. And so this is where I want to close. This is what makes her such an interesting poet. We're only talking about 2 sonnets, but they're really interesting sonnets. So with that, I want to stop here and see if there are any questions or comments.